Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Jay, and I'm at the Vicarage, and we are here today to do our Friday Digging Deeper devotional. And all this week, we're digging deeper into Acts chapter 7, the story and the sermon that Stephen, the deacon, preached to the Sanhedrin. And we've been talking about how one of the things that this passage points out is that we as Christians are part of a never-ending story. Now, we read Acts chapter 7 yesterday, and what we discovered, what you should have seen, or one of the first things you should have noticed, is that the story that you're living as a Christian, and again, going back to lesson number 1 on Monday, Christianity is an experience. It's a story. It's a relationship. It's not a philosophy. It's not just a way of thinking or a way of rewiring the brain. The relationship, the story, the experience requires us to rewire our brain. But it's not primarily about the rewiring of the brain. In other words, Christianity isn't a self-help program. It's not a way to a better you, or just a way to a better you. You will improve your life if you become a Christian. But what you're entering into is a divine relationship with God. And what you're entering into is His story, becoming a true part of history. You are entering into an experience, a daily experience with a supernatural being. But one of the things you should have noticed as we are reading, or as you were reading Acts chapter 7, is that this experience, this relationship, this story that we are beginning to take part in is only a paragraph or a sentence or a chapter in a much longer story. When Stephen is interrogated by the Sanhedrin and they ask him if he is there to tear down the temple and the law of Moses, Stephen launches into the history of faith. And he starts with Abraham. Now, I guess truly he could have gone back much further, but he didn't. He went all the way back to Abraham, and he laid the foundation of his faith. And what you need to know is that the faith that you're living, when people come to you and say, why do you believe the way you believe? Well, you need to draw on your own part of the story. You need to tell people what God has done in your life. But like Stephen, you have to know the whole story. You see, knowing the story helps us to know where we fit into the story. So we look back and we go back to the beginning of Genesis, and we see Adam and Eve and the fall, and we see Cain and Abel and the results of the fall. We see the birth of Seth and his rise to the place of faith, and we see his line walking through time to Noah, and Noah in his righteousness being the only one saved because of his faith. And then we see the rise of Babel and Babylon, and we see Abraham being taken out of that because of his faith. And we see that what God is trying to establish in the earth is this relationship with people. But in order to do that, he has to get personally involved over time, and he has to inject himself into the story of mankind. And you, as a Christian, are one of the ways that God has injected himself into the story, and he has a purpose and a plan for your part of the story, because God is both looking at the macro story, the major story, the moving of nations, the rise and fall of cultures, but he's also looking at the butterfly effect, and he's looking at individual families and individual people And for most of us, that's where we fit into the story, is we are part of the butterfly effect. Most of us aren't the movers and shakers that are going to cause cultures to rise and fall. But when we move according to God's plans and purposes for our lives, we start a domino effect, a small ripple that goes across time and eternity and collectively, we bring a much larger contribution to the story. Not all of us is the Apostle Paul. In fact, almost none of us are the Apostle Paul writing 30% of the Bible. But we all have our little bit to contribute. And we are small parts of the story, and our part is just as important in its own way as the Apostle Paul's role, the Apostle Peter's role was in the story. But if we are to know our part in the story, then we really need to know our God. And we need to know where we fit in the story. All right, we'll talk more about that tomorrow as we conclude the never-ending story. This is the never-ending story part 4. Tomorrow we'll do the never-ending story part 5. Until we meet again, God bless you and be at peace.